And super exciting news, this video is sponsored by our friends over at ClickUp. So more to come on that later, but yeah, shout out to ClickUp for being the first sponsor for one of these devlogs, helping the development of Isadora's Edge very directly. All right, gamers, we're making flying enemies. For some context, cue the B-roll. My name is Shovel, kinda, and I'm working on a 2D action platformer called Isadora's Edge, inspired by Hollow Knight, Mega Man X, Symphony of the Night, focused on really good platforming, really interesting combat, and awesome boss fights. The game is available for wishlisting on Steam, release date to be determined, but if you are interested in potentially playing this when it comes out, then go ahead and add Isadora's Edge to your wishlist, and I'm going to be running a Kickstarter sometime in the future, so it's in its pre-launch phase, so if you're interested in potentially backing the game, getting your name in the credits, maybe getting a boss designed or something, I don't know what the backer rewards exactly are going to be yet, but if you're interested in that, go ahead and follow the project on Kickstarter so that you can be first in line when it finally goes live. One thing that's important for this kind of 2D action platformer is flying enemies. Well, I mean, I guess actually it's not technically necessary, but I like the flying enemies in Mega Man, and I like them in Hollow Knight. So we're making flying enemies, and I'm just going to cut right to the chase. So the flying enemies in the game have gone through 3 basic versions, and I'm going to walk through these 3 stages of flying enemies until we get to the one that we're at now, the final version. The first version of flying enemies that I'll call the OGs was very simple. So the forest has 2 flying enemies. There's the Bottle Sprite and Nuvdu. The Bottle Sprite is a little, like a, what's the word, homunculus? It's like a little guy that was created by the Plague Doctor to go and like patrol the area and make sure that no one comes and bothers her because she hates everyone. And the Nuvdu is an owl. He just lives in the forest. So the idea I originally designed these 2 enemies with were that neither of them were going to have particularly complex flying behavior. The Bottle Sprite was actually just going to be a completely like stationary sentry. Like she's essentially a turret, right? She floats in place, and once you get close to her, she'll throw a potion bottle at you. A potion bottle that she got from the Plague Doctor, by the way, for a little bit of lore there. So if you're in range, she'll throw a potion at you, and if you're out of range, she will stop throwing potions at you. And then Nuvdu was going to be a lot more Mega Man X, Mega Man style enemy, where he was just going to like fly overhead and not really care about where Isadora is at, just fly overhead until he gets to a specific spot, and then will like throw his explosive eggs down. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be a specific distance or throw it at a specific spot. He could go to a specific spot, or he could just fly until he sees Isadora and throw his radioactive egg and then keep flying. Or I can make him like fly and then turn around, you know, but that sort of Mega Man flying enemy, not the one that flies right at you or the Hollow Knight types. Because of their simple design, they were very easy to implement. The Bottle Sprite, I mean, is not even really an enemy. Like, it doesn't need any sort of enemy physics. It just floats in place. Like, it doesn't move, it doesn't react, it doesn't get knocked back. It's just like a sentry. And Nuvdu is literally just moving along a path, and that I can use the enemy physics controller we already have. Which, by the way, if you haven't seen it yet, boom, link to the video where we set up the enemy physics for the second time. And so I can just use the basic enemy physics controller and turn off gravity so that he can just like float through the air. So implementing these 2 types of flying enemies was very easy. It took very little effort to get them basically prototyped. But before I explain the problems with the design of these 2 enemies, I want to take a second and thank the sponsor of this video, ClickUp. One thing that's critically important for the success of an indie dev project is planning and organization, and that's where ClickUp can help you. It's an incredible tool for staying organized, an incredible free tool, by the way, and not like a free trial. It's a permanently free account. And you can hop in there right now with my link, tryclickup.co/inboundshovel. But yeah, let me tell you, I've spent a lot of time with a lot of different organizational tools, honestly using a whole bunch of them at once. And that's because game development is a super multidisciplinary field, right? Like with Fur, I needed design and mood boards for art. With Editor Senpai, we need calendars to schedule content. With my wife INSANDIO, we use tables and lists to track production and schedules and budget. And for my programming tasks, I need a task board with documentation pages. Like without a convenient swim lane view of my tasks, I fall apart. So I used to need a ton of different management tools to handle all of those workloads, but ClickUp makes it possible to keep it all in one place. You can create spaces to separate all the different disciplines into their own environment, and then they have a ton of different tools and views to actually support the needs of that specific discipline. And they have super easy to use migration tools that made it a breeze to collect all my data across all those services that I've been using into one place, which saved me a ton of effort. And side note, their time tracking feature is so sick, dude. When you start working on a task, you can literally click a button that starts a timer directly on that task. So yeah, man, staying organized is super important for any game dev. And ClickUp is a great tool for doing it. So go to tryclickup.co/inboundshovel to see if ClickUp is a good fit for your use case. It's totally free, so there's no risk there. And a big shout out to ClickUp for sponsoring the video. So yeah, let's get back to talking about the Bottle Sprite and Nuvdu because they're not very interesting. The Bottle Sprite feels super weird. The fact that she doesn't chase the player, that she just stays in one spot, that she doesn't get knocked back at all, like all of these things make her feel incredibly strange as an enemy, right? When she was just a floating box, it makes sense that she doesn't move. That didn't feel weird. It just felt like a turret to me. But once she was an enemy, once she looks like this and is just floating in place, not reacting to Isadora hitting her at all, that's when the illusion sort of shatters, and it feels like she's not doing her job patrolling the area as a sentry for the Plague Doctor very well. And then with Nuvdu, I don't hate the idea of enemies that work more like Mega Man X, where they sort of fly overhead, drop a thing, and then continue going. But Nuvdu in particular just felt really strange with the way I was doing that. He would just fly overhead, drop a thing, and I didn't feel the need to interact with him. And honestly, the biggest thing that really stood out to me was how much of a disappointment it felt playing through the rooms that I was putting Nuvdu in compared to how fun it is to fight flying enemies in Hollow Knight. So I decided I needed to take a new approach on how I wanted to do these flying enemies, maybe break from their original design and come up with something new. So the next thing I did was go and study the Hollow Knight enemies. And so here I have I think a 15-minute file of me just fighting, not even fighting, just a 15-minute footage of me dodging the shots from this flying enemy from Hollow Knight, this little bug guy. I believe his official name is a Runkle Splink. Just dodging this Runkle Splink and his shooting, don't look that up by the way. And just throwing his little orange goops at me and dodging out of the way. And I just recorded myself dodging him for a while, and then I went and studied the recording. I went through it frame by frame and really paid attention to what this guy was doing while I was just moving around. How did he react to me getting above him? How did he react to me getting below him, getting close, running away? When did he actually shoot at me? When did he not shoot at me? What is his behavior? So I could figure out what, Team Cherry did to make the really cool flying enemies in Hollow Knight, and I can take an approach similar to that without just ripping off their flying enemies. And so I can sort of distill what they're doing into a very basic pattern of behavior. So the very first thing they do is they pick a target that's a certain distance away from the player. In this case, the knight. For my game, it would be from Isadora. But they pick a point that's a certain distance away from Isadora, and they choose to target that location. That's where they want to fly to. Then they have a list of 3 things that they want to do. If they are in range of their attack, and they can see the knight, and their attack isn't on cooldown, then they do their attack. After their attack check, they check, am I at my target location? If they are at the target location, then they chill. For these Runkle Splonks, I forgot what name I made up. For these enemies in Hollow Knight, their a chill behavior isn't just sitting there idling. They kind of wildly flail around in their spot. But you can tell that once they get to the position they're happy with, if we cut back to the footage, you can see once they get to a position they're happy with respect to the knight, they sort of just squirgle around in place in that general area. So that's their version of chilling. If I can get this working with my flying enemies just sitting in place, then I can start to add some of that jittery behavior so that they feel a little bit more alive. And then, if they are not at their target, they try to fly towards their target. The target is a certain distance away from the knight. So this can mean they do one of 2 things. If they are between the knight and the target, they will fly away, which means if the knight gets too close, it will appear that they are fleeing. On the flip side, if they are not between the knight and the target, then they will try to move towards the target, which feels like they're chasing down the knight because he's running away. So by just doing that, go towards the target if they're not there yet, it sort of gives us that chasing and fleeing behavior that we kind of want for our flying enemies to feel really good. So we have a really basic idea of what we want these flying enemies to do, and it's not too difficult. Time for version 2 of the flying enemies, the Hollow Knight style. So to do this, I added this sort of flying behavior into our enemy physics controller, where I went in, and right now the enemy physics controller has 2 basic states that the enemies can be in. They can be moving or they can be idling. Idling means they're not moving, and moving means they're moving. So that's where a lot of the interesting stuff is, in the direction. Now there are some basic direction types that are left and right, and what happens when you're going direction left is when you call get the movement vector, get the direction I should be going from this direction type, right just returns right. It gives you exactly pointing to the right. Wait, I'm pointing to the right, but the person watching the video, is this also the right? Dude, one day I'll figure this. I finally learned that the cards go up here. But anyway, it means they go to the right. And if it goes to the left, it just hard returns the left. But there's a direction type called follow Isadora. And when that calls into the enemy physics controller that says, hey, calculate the direction vector based on the direction type, it looks at where Isadora is to return what direction they should go. So there's a lot of cool stuff inside of this direction system. So my first approach was to add this Hollow Knight flight behavior as one of the directions they can have. This is obviously stupid, but just bear with me. So I added it as a direction. And then if they're moving, it'll calculate where should I go. And then if its direction type is to follow the Hollow Knight behavior, then it will, when it calls to figure out the direction, it will do all the stuff internally using that target and checking where they are. And it'll do all that stuff and then return the direction vector towards the target to get the behavior we want. When we're too close to the player, when we call in to get our direction vector from the direction type, it'll point away from the player towards the target, right? The problem with this is that it had a lot of unintended side effects where it made things more complicated, and adding cool new features to the following flight behavior, if I wanted to tweak things, it became harder and harder to do that because it was running into issues with the rest of the systems in the enemy physics controller. And that's like a little hand washing, so I'll give you a concrete example. We have collision detectors on the left and the right of the enemy. If the enemy is set to respect walls, when they get to a wall, it'll say, oh hey, you're supposed to respect walls, turn around. This works really good for enemies that are walking along the ground. They see a wall, they turn around, because they said they were going to the left, now they're going to the right. And if they're following Isadora into a wall and then they can't keep going and they don't have a way to jump up and there's a wall in the way, then they will just turn around and walk away. So that works really well for those grounded enemies. But for enemies that are flying, using a direction of flight, when they get to a wall, they see that they should turn around. What does that mean? What does it mean to turn around from flying as if you were in Hollow Knight? That's an example of where it was complicated, and I had to go into like the direction calculation system and have like a special case for the flight follow behavior. And so I realized that doing this type of following behavior as a direction, even though that's sort of how I was doing some of my other cool movement, was using my direction system, I realized it was much better if I actually build it as a different state inside of the enemy physics controller. So then I moved it up a level. Now the enemy physics controller can idle or move or fly. And then the flight has their own flight style. And the one flight style I was using was the Hollow Knight behavior, but I figured I would probably want other flight styles at some point too. So I moved it into the physics controller so that we can idle, move, or fly. And as I was converting it, I was running into some bugs, having some other issues. For example, the hurt box kind of calls into the physics controller. If I need to apply a knockback, for example, if the enemy gets knocked back by Isadora hitting them, the physics controller is the thing that handles movement, so it needs to know that it should be knocked back, and that was being a little complicated. And that's when I had the sudden realization that you probably already have had at this point, which is that flying enemies don't walk on the ground. And also, tangentially, grounded enemies aren't flying. There is no good reason for me to have both of these capabilities built into the same physics controller when they function so differently. Grounded enemies have gravity pulling them on the ground. They have to walk. There has to be collision underneath them for them to move. They generally just move left or right. They only move up if they jump, which causes them to have like air friction values and how does jumping work and when should they jump. Flying enemies don't care about any of that. Flying enemies just fly. So I had the realization that I should have a flying enemy physics controller and a grounded enemy physics controller. I don't have any designs planned where the enemy will convert from grounded to flying or from flying to grounded. So that's not a big deal. The enemy physics controller does not need to handle both. And even if it did, and I wanted to make an enemy that could go from grounded to flying, I could just put both of the physics controller in there and switch which one is active based on the state they're in. So I think that this is a much better way to approach it. And that brings us to version 3. The flying enemy physics controller. Now, one thing that I didn't really touch on yet is that this simplified system of Hollow Knight's behavior actually has quite a few issues. Let me just show you some footage of interacting with the bottle sprite. I turned off the attacking behavior so that I could just see how she flies around in relation to the player, and you can see it's weird. She's turning around a lot. It feels like very strange. Once she gets to Isadora and she just stops, that also feels weird. And she likes to stop facing the wrong way, which is also very strange. And that's because she's always targeting the target point. If she flies towards Isadora and she's coming to a stop as she reaches the target, she will actually fly a little bit past it because there is acceleration and deceleration. Once she flies a little bit past it, she now correctly knows that she's between Isadora and the target location, so she turns around to fly towards her target. I put like a little grace area around the target. She doesn't have to be exactly at it, she just has to be kind of close to the target. Otherwise, she would just flip back and forth around this target the whole time, and that's obviously wrong. But so I put this grace area, and that's what happens. She gets to the target, tries to stop, turns around to face the target, and now she's facing the wrong way. Not to mention that as you're moving around, it feels very obvious to me that she's flying towards a target around Isadora. It doesn't feel like she's actually targeting Isadora. Part of that is like axis flipping, where she needs to make sure she's flying towards like the correct point, where if she's to the left of Isadora, she needs to target a point on the left. If she's to the right of Isadora, she needs to target a point to the right. But that sort of axis flipping stuff can be handled. I realized that my approach of just fly towards the target, the third step of the Hollow Knight system, is not actually very accurate. And so instead, I came up with the donut system. Now, you can think of the donut system as being a single ring around the player that has like the donut hole in the center where Isadora is also, and then the area outside the donut. Now, this donut ring, so you can also just think of it as two circles, but this donut ring, the ring of the donut where the actual like deliciousness would be, is where the deliciousness is for the flying enemies. If they get into that ring of the donut, then they know they can chill. That's how they know that they're like at their target location. If they are in the inner ring, that means they're too close to Isadora and they should flee. And if they are on the outer ring, that means they're too far away from Isadora and they should chase her. This behavior feels so much more natural. And it still uses a target system where it tries to fly toward a target that's in the center of the donut, but once they make it to the donut, it switches from targeting the target to targeting Isadora. That way it fixes the problem where they turn around and flip the target, and because they're in the donut zone, they don't need to like do anything else. Then, if Isadora gets too close, then they realize they need to flee, and they pick a target outside on the outer ring so that they can try to fly away from her. And by separating the behavior like this and having that wide ring where they're happy to chill at, it makes them feel a lot more natural. And then, like I said, I also fixed the sprite flipping so that they're always facing Isadora. And you can see, probably the editor senpai has been showing you this along the way, but you can see how they're flying around, how it feels a lot more natural with this new flying enemy physics controller. And then we just added the simple behavior where it's like, if they are close enough to attack, they see Isadora and it's not on cooldown, throw the attack, otherwise don't do that. And that makes the whole experience of fighting these flying enemies feel a lot better. Now, there is still an issue with sprite flipping. Let's say with the bottle sprite, right, they have like a pretty good knockback. So with Isadora, I can just send them flying upward, and then they need to fly down back to get in range of the donut ring. But when you're flying down, the vector is only very barely pointing to the left, and if Isadora moves, like if she's running back and forth, the vector will constantly flip back and forth between left and right, which will cause the sprite to also flip back and forth as they're basically flying straight down. To get around this, right, to solve this for right now, I normalize the direction vector, which if you don't know what that means, it means I set the magnitude to 1, which means that the x part of the vector will have a value that corresponds to how much they're really going left or right, and then I only flip the sprite if they exceed a certain amount of value. So if you're just slightly shifting left and right as you fly down, they'll stay facing the same way, even though it looks a little weird. But if they exceed that value and actually fly left or right, then the sprite flips correctly. With Nubdo, this isn't a problem because I can just constantly face Isadora, which is what the Hollow Knight sprites do as well. Their default flying animation feels totally fine for moving backwards because it's almost more of like a hover. And so Nubdo also looks totally fine going backwards, at least to me. So let me know if you agree. When they fly away from Isadora, that looks totally fine for them to not flip around. The bottle sprite, on the other hand, she needs to flip to face the direction she's going or it feels really weird, which does cause a little bit of weirdness, but I think it's okay. And if you watching have any good ideas about how to handle the sprite flipping, anything better than the direction magnitude, let me know because I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. Usually people in my comments have really good ideas, so would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I still need to build some sort of like jittery behavior for when they're chilling in the donut. When they're safe, they can like fly around a little bit, do a little bit of wandering in that zone. I haven't nailed down exactly how I want to do that yet. I was thinking maybe once they start chilling, they're on a timer where they chill for like a certain amount of time before they're even willing to flee or chase again, but I haven't tested that yet. For the bottle sprite at least, I'm totally happy with how she feels just going completely idle. Once she's in range, she's doing her job as a sentry. For Nubdo, he also doesn't feel that bad being completely still, although maybe I can try a little bit of jitteriness for him, but that's like getting into the weeds on these enemies when we already have our successful flying enemies, baby. Let me know what you think of this flying behavior. I still think there's totally a place in the game for the Mega Man X style, just like fly overhead and drop something, but for these enemies, I felt like they needed to be a little bit souped up. I know Hollow Knight does have some enemies that just sort of like bounce around the stage, but even those are like quite active with how much they're bouncing around the stage. They aren't the like fly overhead and just do something version. So that's a wrap on the flying enemies. Thanks for watching. I hope you like it. Interested to hear what y'all think about the flying enemies. It's something that I've been slowly working on in the background while I do other stuff as well, because the first version I didn't like, and then the second version had problems, and now I finally have a third version that's cool, and then I've been adding tweaks to it. I thought this was a good time for me to finally like talk to y'all about it, put the flying enemies in front of you, and get some thoughts from the community. Peace out. See you next time.